Today, when we approach the phenomenon of China's growth, we still consider a country whose income is around the global average, which is still well below Western standards. However, we shouldn't think for a moment that it has always been this way. In fact, for much of its history, the Chinese Empire was one of the most prosperous regions on the planet. Europeans looked upon their delicate silk fabrics with envy, the high level of their mathematicians, and the vast sea and land trade routes that 12th century Chinese had established. They had mastered agricultural techniques not seen in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. They were by far the most agriculturally productive country on the planet. Welcome to Money Dynamo. Subscribe to the channel and make sure you don't miss any of my videos. But friends, we're not just talking about agriculture. By the 10th century, the Celestial Dragon Empire was producing 5 to 6 times more iron per capita than the most prosperous regions of Europe. And don't forget, the compass, gunpowder, paper, and even printing were all inventions of ancient China. China had long been one of the wealthiest, most fertile, best cultivated, most industrialized, and most populous countries in the world. However, let me pose a question. Who was China's Galileo or Newton? The truth is, no name readily comes to mind. Perhaps it's simply due to the distance of that reality. Nonetheless, beyond gunpowder and paper, there weren't significant relatively modern scientific advancements like the steam engine, light bulb, or microscope that originated in China. Despite its relatively advanced economy, it was the Europeans who led both the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution. So, the question seems quite clear: what happened that caused China to fall behind? Why did it end up losing the technological race despite starting with such an advantage? And mind you, this is not a simple question. In fact, it has sparked so much discussion that it even has its own name. This phenomenon is known as the Niham effect, named after the great scientific historian Joseph Niham, who wrote over 25 volumes on the progress of Chinese science, medicine, and technology. But if you want to know why China lagged behind, well, today at Visual Economic, we'll tell you. Let's dive in. As we mentioned in the introduction, Niham's puzzle is genuinely challenging to answer, and economists can't seem to agree. But we have to start somewhere, and indeed, there is one point where everyone agrees. In the 15th century, under the orders of a Ming Dynasty emperor, a Chinese naval fleet of 62 large ships embarked on 7 large-scale expeditions. These expeditions explored from the South China Seas to the Persian Gulf. China was a maritime and military power. However, how many of these expeditions do you think took place in the following century? The same number, perhaps half? No, there were none, 0 expeditions. But it's not just about expeditions. For some nearly incomprehensible reason, the subsequent Chinese emperor imposed a total ban on international voyages by ship. To give you an idea of how strict the prohibition was, over 3,500 ships were ordered to be burnt. From then on, due to the 400-year self-imposed naval blockade, China was practically isolated from major international affairs. As you can imagine, this led to the Chinese losing access to the latest innovations of the time, from the spectacular development of the banking system to the wonders coming from the new continent. All of this resulted in the rest of the world getting richer while China stagnated and even began to lose purchasing power. However, don't think this resolves the video. There's more to ask. For example, why on earth did China destroy its maritime power in such a manner? Also, why, within China itself, couldn't they technologically evolve independently without relying on the rest of the world, even when isolated? And perhaps the answer to these puzzles isn't a single factor. In fact, we can point out 3 major issues that hindered the technological development of the Asian giant. So let's go through them. If there's one thing that's true, both today and 500 years ago, it's that there were and are a lot of Chinese. And for some economists, here lies the reason why China never underwent an industrial revolution. As you can see in this graph, the available land for sustaining food production in China became increasingly scarce compared to a population that kept growing. And what were the consequences of all this? The most significant one is that there was never a shortage of cheap labor in China. With so many people, wages remained very low, and entrepreneurs had fewer incentives to invest in automation. This would explain why, while Europeans used Gutenberg's printing press, the Chinese used a much more primitive woodblock printing press that required 3 times the time and double the workers. In the end, with so many workers and such low wages, it didn't matter. But if that weren't enough, many Chinese emperors were entirely hostile to free trade, property rights, and freedom of expression. Ultimately, this translated to little entrepreneurship, innovation, and business activity. In China, there was no private initiative. There existed a series of state monopolies covering key consumer products like salt, iron, tea, and alcohol, as well as foreign trade. However, as we mentioned before, this is just one explanation. There are still 2 more reasons that explain the significant decline of the Chinese Empire compared to Europe. Let's ask a question: what political system did China have? Well, many historians and economists define it as bureaucratic feudalism. Essentially, the emperor had much more power than the absolute monarchs in Europe. Instead of different nobles scattered throughout the territory, there was a highly hierarchical army of bureaucrats. China was an enormous and entirely unified territory, and all of that meant that there wasn't much political competition. If the emperor issued an order very damaging to the economy, there weren't other nobles or independent territories that could oppose it, as could happen in Europe. For example, consider for a moment what would have happened if the Spanish Empire had decreed the same self-imposed naval blockade that China did. In that case, it would have been the Portuguese, Italians, or English who would have taken to the seas to discover America. Let's say that Europe had the advantage of competition between countries, laws, and monarchs. And that was also applied to science. Meaning, if a scientist were censored and persecuted in one European country, they could always move to another country and continue working. Something that would have been impossible in China directly. The collection of more or less independent states in Europe created favorable conditions for scientific development. China, on the other hand, was governed by a dominant ideological system backed by absolute political power, and no genuine public debate was allowed. But considering the economic and political reasons, there is still one that generates a lot of debate but could be as relevant as the previous 2. Look, do you remember the maritime expeditions that China undertook in the 15th century? The commander of the initial expeditions, Chingge, was known and respected in Europe as the Chinese Marco Polo. However, there was a huge difference between Marco Polo and Chingge because while the former was highly respected among Europeans, who recounted his stories in taverns and fantasized, the Chinese barely knew their national hero. It simply seemed that the wonders of other places that Chingge told them about didn't matter to them. The Chinese were not interested in the outside world. And perhaps an example that clearly illustrates this phenomenon is the letter that Emperor Qianlong wrote to George III, refusing a trade agreement because, according to him, the English had nothing that interested them. And mind you, this happened in the year 1793. By that time, the English had at least a 200-year technological superiority over the Chinese, and the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. So, you tell me if the Chinese would have had many trade benefits negotiating with the United Kingdom. But well, they simply didn't want to. And be that as it may, considering all these theories, now the questions are for you. Which explanation convinced you the most about the stagnation of the Chinese Empire? Was the imperial examination and societal bureaucratization the true cause of this setback? Or do you think there are even more determining factors that could explain everything? You can leave your answer in the comments. And as always, don't forget that here at Money Dynamo, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the bell icon to not miss any of the upcoming ones. From our side, that's all for now. Greetings, and see you soon.